out there in Guitar Moderne land. Where to begin to talk about Joe Gore? He's responsible for me being in this game at all. He was an editor of Guitar Player magazine and was about to go on the road with PJ Harvey. He knew that I wrote for Stereophile magazine at that time, and he suggested that they hire me to pick up some of the slack, not as an editor, but as a freelancer. But that's just where we met about 30 years ago. Joe's a guitar player. He's played with Tracy Chapman, PJ Harvey, Tom Waits. He consulted for Apple for their Logic software. He builds pedals. He puts together guitars. The list goes on and on. His new record might seem odd to cover as it's 14th century music, I believe, but Joe is an expert on the subject, and he's taken that music and made it new by playing it on electric guitar and using samples and doing all sorts of things to make it relevant to the time we live in. And it's a terrific record. I highly suggest you check it out. Just go to YouTube. It's his only solo record, and look for Joe Gore. We talked for a long time because we had a lot to catch up on, and we also are both interested in a wide range of subjects around music. I hope you find it as interesting as we did. There were some Zoom glitches. Ultimately, it turned out that he needed to update his Zoom software, so he did, and the end of the interview goes smoothly. I edited out the worst parts. You will see both me and him freeze visually occasionally, but the audio remains pristine, so I kept that stuff in. Anyway, I hope you enjoy our talk as much as I did. Please don't forget to check out my sponsors, Red Panda and Earthquaker, and a new addition, Source Audio. They're now advertising with me, and they make some of the best pedals for modern guitar players, between their synth pedals and the new Ultra Wave, and just amazing stuff. So please check them out. You can go to my website, the Guitar Moderne website, and just click through the ads. Would be a great way to help me out. Or you can click, I'll put the links in the video as well. So sit back and enjoy my talk with Joe Gore. Now we go way back. And he was about to tell me a clown story, and we all love a good clown story.
I have to suck up to Michael a little bit more first. No, I've known Michael since the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah, you gave me my job basically at Guitar Player.
Well, I knew you as a musician around town. Then I knew you as a guy who worked in the best guitar shop in town. And then I knew you as a fellow magazine freelancer. And even though we've lived on opposite sides of the country for years, you're one of the my top 2 or 3 social media correspondents. So yeah, like Michael said, we go pretty far back.
Yeah.
And
so
I really enjoy your magazine, Michael, and you do really cool stuff, and no one respects an unprofitable labor of love more than me.
So when we left our hero, he was going to tell me a clown story, because everybody loves a good clown story.
I've had a clown. I until recently had an early model clown. It was the one that we reviewed in Guitar Player in, I'm thinking, early '96. And I wound up buying the review model and hung on to it. It stayed on my pedal board for years. Then my interests changed a little bit. Then I started building pedals, and I have a half dozen clones here. And I did a big clone shootout review for one of the guitar magazines last year. And I don't generally sell my gear, and I'm certainly not a gear speculator. I never buy to resell. I just buy weird shit I like. But the clone had gotten ridiculously valuable, and I thought, I really don't need this, and I could get something nice with it, with the money. I bet I could get $2,000 for this. And I'm in this guitar nerd chat group with a lot of guitar players who are more successful and famous than I. And one of them is Richard Fortus from Guns N' Roses and Psychedelic Furs, who is a massive gear collector and knows more about gear than anyone I've ever worked with at a guitar magazine. And I was telling him I thought I might sell my Klon. I could maybe get 2,000, maybe 25. And he said, dude, ask 7,
Oh,
except 6. And I did just that. I sold the frickin' thing for $6,000 and used half the money to buy the most beautiful acoustic guitar I've ever owned. It's this lovely 15-year-old all mahogany Bill Collings that smells really good. And so that's my prop for the interview, to make me look like a musician.
yeah. Well, it's gorgeous. Yeah, the Klon thing is insane. Well, I guess that begs the question. I mean, you've tried all these different Klons. I'm loath as I am to get into a discussion of Klons because I remember when Chris Cobb from Real Guitars, who we both know, got his and said, "Oh, this thing's the most amazing thing in the world," and plugged it in. I'm thinking, what? You know, it's a boost. It's a nice boost. And in the interim, there have been so many clones, as you know, that are probably just as good or within that, 1% where in a real life playing situation, you never hear the difference. So, but from your point of view, having had an old original one and having built them and own various versions and clones, do you think the original has some sort of magic that is
Absolutely. If it's 1996, when it came out, it really did make some important design breakthroughs. It really was an improved tube screamer, and some of the innovative features included, rather than using a gain control, it fades between a clean and a distorted signal, has a charge pump to run at 18 volts, so you get a little more air on top, a little more headroom on the sound, really beautifully sculpted tone control. So it was a big deal 27 years ago. But there's nothing in a Klon that's magic. There's no special parts. There's nothing rare. You can build a sound-alike, work-alike for about $60 in parts, maybe a little more because one of the pots is kind of expensive. There's this dual gang pot, but no, in the modern context, there's absolutely nothing special about it. But it's gotten to the point where people collect it as a fetish object, like they would certain musical instruments. It's just because it's the one. But sonically, no, there's absolutely no reason to give a special value to the Klon. And it's not like you're talking about old guitars or old amps where maybe they were superior materials in the past, or maybe it's benefited from decades of age and use, or maybe there were people who had certain technological skills that we lack nowadays. So even for someone who loves old guitars and amps and doesn't like playing new stuff, just as true.
right.
I'll go a step more controversial on that. I don't think there's any vintage stomp boxes that can't be done better and more reliably today, with one teensy exception. And the teensy exception is products that include materials that are no longer legal. So I would love to have a new production oil can reverb or delay, but the electrostatic fluid violates Rose treaties, and it's just not safe to use. Some of the parts in the original Univibe are not kosher anymore. But those are the tiny exceptions. There is nothing that you can't do better today. If you're collecting old stomp boxes, you're collecting it for the memory and the fetish value, or it's working and it sounds great, but there's nothing that can't be replicated as well or better.
Right.
I wouldn't say that about guitars or amps, but it's out for stomp boxes. Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah. And there's the other thing which people don't talk about. And not that I want to go down, well, since you build stomp boxes, I guess we can go down a stomp box rabbit hole a bit. But
I want to talk about me.
we're going to talk about you. But the other thing is that what people don't realize is given, and I'm sure you know this, given parts tolerances, there's every chance that I didn't know this till recently, or realized this till recently, that no two stomp boxes of exactly the same vintage and, run could sound significantly different just because
Well,
the tolerances are different.
the part tolerances range between 5 and 20%. So I think that some of the cork sniffing videos where you have the clone and the clone and somebody identifies a slight difference, you're just as likely to get the same difference between two clones with successive serial numbers. There is some variance from part to part.
Well, exactly.
So that's a bigger factor. And again, we're talking in a super pristine studio, listening in isolation in a hi-fi situation with no other competing sounds context. And if it's really hard to perceive any difference in that context, you really aren't going to hear any difference in a club or in a mix or through the PA at a concert. It just really becomes academic quickly.
Right. But it's interesting because I have heard people talk now about that you do want to check more than one version of the pedal when you get it, because there may be those kind of differences that you're going to hear. And you should go for like anything else. If you go in a guitar store to buy a new guitar, you might want to try 3 or 4 versions of any model that you're trying, because they're going to differ significantly also. I mean, they all come from different parts of the tree and they different woods. I mean, this guy Charles Whitfield, do you know him? He makes tellies. Are you familiar with
I don't think so, but
yeah, I think he's from North Carolina. He brought over 3, I think, for me to review for Guitar Player once, and they're phenomenal guitars. I mean, he's one of those guys that has the secret of making them feel and sound vintage.
mm-hmm.
So he brought over 2 or 3 for me to check and pick the one that I wanted to review. They sounded like night and day. They all sounded great, but no 2 of them sounded the same. And yeah, I was just going to say, so it's just a question of, with anything vintage or new that you buy that's not some sort of electronic device with incredibly tight tolerances, the odds are you're going to get, from item to item of even the same vintage, you need to check out which one you like the best, basically.
Yeah, and it's probably less true in the past, since we're doing computer assisted design these days. But yes, even so, exactly as you say, there can be a difference between even 2 things that are made on through the same CAD process. There might be a variation. With electronics, it's complicated because they all interact. And I should mention that you and I went back and forth a few years ago about the tone capacitor issue, which is I believe that in a guitar tone circuit, the exact value of the capacitor is immensely important, but the material it's made of makes no difference. And I made a video, I thought, demonstrating my point, but some people with sharp ears, including you, claim to perceive perceptible difference. It goes over my head, and I know that there's people who can hear things I can't hear. But whenever weighing those kind of questions, I think it's worthwhile to back off and talk about what is the usage scenario. If you put it in a track with drums, it's not gonna matter. If you're gonna run it through compressors and EQ, it's not going to matter. If you're going to play it in a noisy club, it's not going to matter. It's like one of those things that you could worry about, or you could spend the time practicing and get a lot more done. But it's tricky. It's hard to. This is also speaking. You and I have both been reviewing guitar gear for decades, and it's been proven to me again and again that my hearing changes over the course of a listening session. I think it does for most people. Tonal memory is terrible. So like if you're playing a guitar, popping in a new part and then playing again and say, oh, that sounds a little brighter or livelier. I mean, unless you have some kind of freakish superhuman ears, that's not a reliable measure. So for years now, I've tried as much as possible to do audio and musical instrument product reviews in a controlled environment, preferably using a reamp. So if I'm comparing stomp boxes, I like to make a test recording, set up a signal chain, and then run the identical performance through the two competing pieces of gear with nothing else changing in the tone chain in the course of a single session, not coming back 2 days later. And I think there you get something kind of reasonable. Where that reasoning falls down is when you're doing something that involves a part of the guitar that's upstream from the amp or the recording chain, like reviewing guitar pickups.
Well, wouldn't you record them?
Do two different performances.
I mean, wouldn't that, I mean, in all these situations, the best thing probably in terms of tonal memory would be to record each performance, whether it's through reamping or personal, is, to record them. I mean, that's what I try and do. But even then, you try, the problem is when you record them, you lose some of the nuance. I find you lose some of the nuance. Like I tried to do a demo of the Planet Waves cables, which are, they made their kind of, I don't know if they were low impedance, but they were supposedly produced more high end. I think I achieved it with that. I actually recorded, different parts with the same part with different cables. And I thought it came.
But was there a reamp? Or you just played the same part twice with different cables?
I think I was just playing the same part, but it was, over the course of the part, you should be able to hear the brightness or darkness of it, unless you're really hitting harder or doing something different. But even then, not every note is going to be, they're all going to be different, and they're all going to be different on the thing.
And of course.
But the other, but I tried to do it with picks, and that just was a no-go.
Oh, I have a strong opinion. I've done tests like that too. Also, I didn't specifically say recording when I was talking before. Given this is recording, you can't tell during the session. You have to make benchmark recordings and listen back with fresh ears in a neutral environment. So yeah, of course, everything's recorded. I got a controversial opinion about the sound of picks based on my tests. It's really, really, really hard to hear a difference in pick material through an electric guitar pickup. It can change the way you play dramatically. You might play different phrases. It might change your dynamics. You might attempt things you might not attempt with the other pick. So you're likely to get a very different performance. And there is something to be said for swapping picks for a change of attitude or change of perspective, or just to shake out your head and start again. But if you're talking about a control situation where you're just playing whole notes on the guitar and recording them, it does not, you'd be shocked how little difference there is. Acoustic guitar, there's a difference. You hear it on acoustic guitar, but not through an electromagnetic.
Yeah. I wouldn't be shocked. I mean, because I don't know if my audio died or something, but I was saying that I can hear it when I'm playing it on an electric, but then when I record it and try and demonstrate the difference between the different materials, and you try and listen to it on the recording, something in the chain between playing it and the audio on the recording, that difference that I heard gets either minimized or disappears. So it does make you wonder how much of it is psychological or a feel thing, it's more how you're feeling playing it, as you were saying, or that. But before we go, let's go. So we've gotten into the gear stuff, and maybe we could start there, because there's so many. I mean, you are the original polymath. There are so many aspects to your career. But actually, let's start at the beginning. So you started as a guitar player, essentially.
Well, keyboard was my first instrument.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I've been playing keyboards since I was a little kid. and I wasn't very good. And then guitar, I fell in love with, and then I started taking it seriously, as a tween. But I had like forced piano lessons in my single digit ages. Um, but I did just pass my 50th anniversary playing guitar last year.
So, when did you start writing for? I mean, the next, I think, I feel like the next phase of your career was writing for Guitar Player and writing for the guitar magazines. So, how did that come about?
Well, here's a quickie bio, and stop me if I talk too long. I grew up playing 70s rock and folk, for a couple of years. And then by the time I was partway through high school, I became a classical music geek and really quickly lost interest in rock and was very focused on classical music. And I went to music school as a performance major, and then got really into early music from before 1650. And I was playing lute and playing in early music ensembles. So this whole new album is revisiting that. Then I drifted away from that into music composition, and went to graduate school in composition. But kind of punk happened during that time, and my rock was winning my allegiance back. Rock was getting really exciting and compelling, especially post-punk, when it got a little more experimental and weird. And I wound up dropping out of the PhD program to play in bands. My first bands were bands I was very lucky to be in. During that time in the San Francisco Bay Area, there was the most vibrant expatriate African music scene in Oakland. And I, studied with a renowned African drummer, and then eventually became his bandmate and started playing in all these groups with a bunch of guys from Ghana and Nigeria. And man, I just lived for Afrobeat. It was such a passion. And then started doing my own bands that were mostly funky dance music, and some of them were reasonably popular. And then when I was pushing 30, it was like, oh, I need a real job. And the late Tom Wheeler, God bless him, he hired me as Guitar Player. But I was nearly 30 when I started that.
Right. But then you left that to go play with PJ Harvey, if I'm not mistaken, because that's when you had them bring me on board, I guess, to take up some of the writing slack, if my memory serves. Was that the case?
Yeah, I mean, the ironic part is I went through that phase that a lot of aspiring musicians go through, of giving it a go for a few years, and maybe not getting the success you hope to, and starting to look forward and thinking about getting a real job. And when I took Guitar Player, it was an amazing opportunity, and I met wonderful people and suddenly got to interact with some of the greatest musicians on the planet. But there was also an element of mourning about it. I felt like, well, I'm giving up being a musician, and I'm taking a career as a music related career that's not being a musician. And then as soon as I thought that, then I also started getting cool gigs and playing, and getting paid to play on records and tour. So just goes to show you, don't despair. There are good things that can happen after age 30 as a musician.
Well, so how did the PJ Harvey gig come about?
Well, she knew of my work with Tom Waits, and she was a Waits fan, and I think she was a fan of the Bone Machine and Black Rider albums, and it was the Tom Association when the original band PJ Harvey, the trio, broke up, and she wanted to play with other people, and same reason that Eric, the great keyboardist bassist Eric Drew Feldman, was in that band too, and it was because Polly was a huge Captain Beefheart fan, and Eric played in one of the later versions of Beefheart's band. So she was kind of turning to players who'd worked with musicians she dug. And it was also another kind of stroke of luck thing, because she's a seriously great guitar player. And she just happened to be going through a phase where she wanted to explore being a front woman and being more dramatic and dancing and moving on stage, and didn't want to stand behind a guitar the whole evening. So, a lot of the reason I was there was because she wanted to take a little break from guitar playing, and so another strange stroke of luck. But Polly is a very, very good guitarist.
Yeah, I loved her work on, the early trio records. Which begs the question, how did the Tom Waits gig come about?
Through Les Claypool. I'd known Les Claypool since he was 17 or so, and he was a roadie for my Almost Was 80s band. And yeah, he was a great bass player even then. He was kind of playing sort of like how we became famous for playing, and we'd all think, wow, that's amazing, but come on, I mean, it's who wants to hear half Rush and half Brothers Johnson? And laughs on us, because the whole freaking world wanted to hear Rush meets Brothers Johnson. When Tom left New York for California, he connected with Les, and Les, God bless him, put in a good word with Tom for me. So thank you, Les.
Right. Yeah. And then the Tracy Chapman gig, when did that come about?
That was early. That was right. I'm thinking the year after, probably 2002, year after 9/11, and that again was from a recommendation from a fellow musician whose band was managed by Tracy's management, and he threw my name in the hat, and that's how that one happened, and that was a wonderful experience. Tracy too is a far, far, far better guitar player than people realize. She can play blistering single note guitar. Oh. She generally doesn't. She kind of plays it safe on stage, and for good reason, focuses on her songs, not her voice. But when she's goofing around and letting her hair down, she rips. And on acoustic guitar, I probably played 100 shows with Tracy, and she made one or two mistakes out of all those shows. Literally, I mean, like we know people, Robbie Berger's like that. We all know a few musicians like that. I'm sure there's a lot of them in your neck of the woods in Nashville who just, they don't screw up. It's like perfect the first time and every time after. And Tracy's one of those.
Rob's in Nashville now. Rob Berger is in Nashville now.
Oh, I know. Have you crossed paths with him?
No. I think he moved.
Yeah, I know. I know.
During COVID. Rob Berger being a great keyboard organ player. So in Tracy's band,
played with.
Yeah. So in Tracy's band, I mean, her music is not known for having a any kind of outside feeling to it for the most part. Certainly not Polly's. So how did you fit yourself into that milieu, as it were?
It did feel like outside of my expertise at the time, but it's complicated. Well, first, Tracy won me over with her supreme musicianship and her general coolness. I love Tracy. She's a wonderful, wonderful person, a delight to work with. She's done me so many kindnesses. Tracy's the best. And the music isn't outside at all, but she's a great believer in letting a performance be a performance. And she's never slavish about reproducing the records. And she could be, and the audiences would probably dig it if she sounded exactly like the albums. But even though the music isn't, outside harmonically and melodically, there is an element of chance and randomness. And it was absolutely a challenge. Then it became more of a challenge when she got into the idea of touring with a trio with no bass. So I was playing, baritone guitar and playing, bass and lead guitar at the same time. And that was really, really hard and really fun. So it was never phoning it in with Tracy. It was a challenge. And again, her musicianship is so high that she sets a standard that a daunting standard of never fucking up.
Well, it seems you'd be the perfect person to be playing bass and lead at the same time with your classical background. I mean, you probably have a kind of independence that a lot of guitar players wouldn't have.
There's probably something to that. But then, you look at somebody like our pal Charlie Hunter,
Well,
who
that's yeah.
plays more. Well, he plays as maybe the greatest one of the two or three greatest polyphonic guitar players ever, like up there with Ted Green or George Van Epps.
Yeah.
And he's not a classical dude. He's just a great musician who listens well. And he's a million years beyond me on what he can do, in terms of playing simultaneous part.
Well, he focused on that. I mean, for his whole life. I mean, that's basically
not his whole life.
Most of his life.
Now I'm gonna reveal my age again, and I knew Charlie since he was a teen. This is all in San Francisco Bay Area in the '80s. He was a rockabilly dude.
Right.
He played like Brian Setzer, and really well. He's a good singer and player. But then he went away and practiced for a couple of years, and it was like Cinderella. Like, fuck, he went from being a solid guitar player to how the fuck is he doing that? Drop dead guitar player in just a couple of years. He always says it's from panhandling. He went to Europe and played on the streets, he says, and that's how he learned to do it. But in terms of, I can't think of a more dramatic example of somebody who went from good to great in a dizzyingly short time.
Yeah. He's a freak of nature on a certain level. I see. I know what you mean about Tracy because I watched an Austin City Limits thing where you guys did "Give Me One Reason," and the version on the record is our friend Adam Levy, doing his best BB King imitation, and the version you did on Austin City Limits is a much more up tempo, almost pop version.
That's her. I couldn't play a King style solo if I wanted to, and I really, really, really don't want to play a King style solo in the first place. It's just that vocabulary doesn't speak to me, or doesn't speak to me after 1970 or so. So I was really grateful that Tracy was not expecting me to be Adam. And Adam, of course, is a dear friend of both of ours, and one of the finest men ever to draw breath, and a very, very profound musician with a Yoda-like Zen wisdom about guitar and life. And Adam is a lofty, lofty dude, but he was the guy for the play the blues solo gig, not me.
All right. Well, that's funny you mention that because
Tracy
right. I was watching your Tone Fiend channel, which is yet another part of your total oeuvre, as it were, and you were doing
all about the oeuvre.
The oeuvre. You were demonstrating something, and you were playing surprisingly bluesy in a way that I've never really heard you play before, and so you do have some of that in you.
It's just it probably meant I was tired and not being creative. Let me say this the right way, because I say stuff like this all the time, and it's really offensive to a lot of guitar players who do love that vocabulary. I love blues music up to a point, but the language stops meaning stuff to me after around 1970 or so. And I've always had a great disinterest in later players who recreate the style of earlier masters, no matter how well they do it. I've always would rather hear someone barely competent do something startling than hear a master play the expected masterfully. And that's probably my modernist background as a classical musician, but I've always gone for the weirdos and the primitives, and sometimes the virtuosos. But I think that a lot of people who go to that blues well as guitar players are playing on autopilot and scrunching up their face and thinking they feel emotion, and I'm not getting any emotion from the playing. I think it's just it's muscle memory. And yeah, I do have a lot of scorn for latter day blues players who let me say this differently. I think there's a lot to be said for studying music and playing it note for note. One of the favorite things I ever heard was the great guitarist Mark Ribot talking about studying other players. And he once told me that he was studying Chuck Berry and he was making sure to reproduce all the mistakes. You know, because sometimes those records are, you know, they were recorded really fast and there's little clams and flubs. And he was making the clams and flubs part of his study. So I think there's absolutely unspeakable value to get really inside a player and discover what they do. But then at some point, I think you're duty bound to add your thing to it, and not just you know, recap their trip.
Yeah, well, that's a whole other discussion, and it's you're completely right. I mean, that's the whole. You know, I mean, don't get me started on what you know Ted Drozdowski. Have you ever met Ted? He's another writer. Oh, well, of course you know.
Oh,
Ted.
yeah, we know. Well, first of all, you know, I was a fan of Ted long before I met him. Just as a you know, Musician magazine in the '80s, you know, that was really important in journalism at the time. They really pioneered covering pop music in a super intelligent, well-informed, ear to the street way, and they had a hipness and a authenticity that, you know, a lot of publications lacked. And they talked about music in the technical language of music, as opposed to, say, reading a great writer in Rolling Stone who can, you know, write a beautiful rhapsody about, you know, Jimi Hendrix, but really can't give you any insight into what made Jimi Hendrix Jimi Hendrix.
Well, that's why it was called Musician magazine. That was, I think that was kind of the point. But my point about Ted was
Ted was part of that crew, and it's just like, you know, when I finally met Ted, it was like, you know, wow, the stuff you wrote was so important to me. And now we're buddies, and he's been really supportive of my record, and which is lovely. And Ted's a great guy.
We talk about the blues thing all the time. You know, I mean, we talk about the blues hammer bands. You know, that's did you ever see Ghost World, the movie?
Yeah, right. I forgot that. Yeah,
Blues hammer. You know, I mean, that's kind of what blues became post '70s, and I think that's kind of what you're talking about. But before we go down the blues rabbit hole, I was curious what kind of gear you were taking, because people love this. What kind of gear, how your gear, I guess, differed between what you played in the Poly gig and what you were playing with Tracy Chapman. How did that adapt to the music you were playing?
I used a lot of the same instruments, but like the first recordings of Note that I played on were with Tom Waits, and you know, Tom Waits's Act 2 persona that he created with his wife and co-writer Kathleen Brennan was really well established at that point. You know, Rain Dogs had been my favorite record for a few years, and Frank's Wild Years, and all the records he made in New York before he came to California. So we had a good imprint of what the Tom aesthetic was. And then when he moved to rural Northern California, it was kind of the same sort of abstract, noisy thing, but it kind of took a, you know, he was less of like a weird urban hipster and more like a crazy farmer, you know, building weird machines in his barn kind of persona. So I knew from the very first time I went to play with Tom that it was, you know, bringing weird stuff, broken stuff, obscure stuff that didn't sound, quote, good, was what it was all about. Even when I talked to him about coming to play with him for the first time, he specifically said no Strats. And I do play Strats on some of Tom's records and some of my favorite stuff, but I don't think he literally meant the Stratocaster guitar. I think he just meant, you know, no rock dude stuff. So from that point, I was collecting weird instruments and weird amps and broken pedals, and things that were broken that would make weird, wheezy, creaking sounds. And Tom dug that stuff, and it fit into Polly's sound world too. Not so much Tracy's sound world, but I was using the same guitars and things that you know, that I'd been using earlier. And also, it's kind of Tracy who got me into building stomp boxes, because one thing I like about her is she's really freaking smart, and she has a restless, curious mind, and she's always studying, always learning something different. You know, she learned how to weld. She learned how to tie all the knots in the Boy Scout handbook. She reads about, you know, science and history. She's just an interesting, inquisitive mind. And she said, "Oh, we should try building some guitar pedals." And that's what put the bug in my head. And she kind of dropped the ball and I ran with it. But it was kind of Tracy's inspiration that got me into doing that in the first place.
That's interesting. How did you end up consulting for Apple?
I met some of the Apple people because I was the demo artist for version 1 of Native Instruments Guitar Rig. And I got hired to demo it at WWDC, Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference. And that was the one time I met Steve Jobs. He was a dick. And it was this amazingly intense experience of rehearsing maybe 100 times for this spiel. You watch the Apple presentations and people seem casual and they use their hands a lot. And I'm really excited to tell you today about this incredible thing. And however off the cuff it looks, it's not. They've been practicing that till their brains are dripping out of their ears. It's a high pressure gig. And through that I met some people, and I think a couple Apple people were into a project that I did with my wife, Elise Malberg. We did a project in the aughts about, it was kind of a web hoax. We created a fake record label called Clubbo, C-L-U-B-B-O, and manufactured a historic roster of artists. And we were working with a great photographer and graphic designer, our dear departed friend Richie Leeds, and like faking album covers from the 70s and doctoring old photos and inventing these characters, some of whom were portrayed by by voice actors. Like Chuck Prophet came in and portrayed kind of a parody of Jim Morrison. Mark Eitzel came in and portrayed kind of a parody of a Donovan type character. And it was just this crazy money losing, but very popular website. And I think that might have, I think some Apple people might have been a fan of that too. So it's just kind of connections on the outside.
And what kind of stuff did you consult with them on about?
I started working with them on Logic 8, and I'm signatory to the most restrictive non-disclosure agreement in history, but I think I'm allowed to say that I did a lot of work on the stuff you'd expect I would work on: virtual guitar, virtual amps, virtual pedals, sound designing that, and a lot of the guitar. I had a hand in a lot of the guitar components in Logic. Components that haven't really changed for the last 12 years and are desperately in need of an update. So don't judge me. It was state of the art for 2008, 2009. But some of that stuff actually holds up well and some of it doesn't. But that's it. Working with Apple is an astonishing experience. First of all, they're just the people I work with are great guys who are now among my closest friends. And it was really challenging. The standards were incredibly high. The work was really hard. The pay was really good. And it was just.
So Joe, what exactly were you doing for Apple?
It was a sound design job.
And that being, what does that exactly entail?
With Logic 8, it involved simply writing sounds for the existing components. With Logic 9, they started developing the current system of amps and pedals with the amp designer and pedal board and bass amp plugins.
And when you say writing sounds, are you talking about creating presets from?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
I didn't contribute performances. I don't play on the Apple loops or anything like that.
Right.
But presets, and with Logic 9 and 10, I was part of the team developing the new plugins.
Okay, so yeah, you would give them ideas for what they might want to come up with, and they
It was
would.
the people, the guy who, he was the then new head of Logic, and he's still there, as a guy named Xander Soren. I don't know if you know Xander, but Xander's a fine guitar player and a really interesting, cool dude. And he was very ambitious about what he wanted to do. And a lot of it was just as simple as sitting down with guitars and pedals and making recordings, and making lists of priorities. And I probably shouldn't say a ton more than that, but my gig was part of the team that defined the look and functionality of these plugins, and I had a big hand in sound designing them, both how they sound and the presets. And that's probably all I should say.
Well, when you say that, are you still working for Apple? Do you still work?
Haven't done it for years, and partly because they haven't updated the guitar stuff. I'm not speaking now with any inside knowledge of Apple. This is just talking as Apple user and an observer. But they clearly made a decision that there was a lot more interest in non-guitar genres, and most of the focus has gone into mixing and recording tools, synthesizers, various ways of making beats and making tracks. Because I assume, nobody's told me this, it's just a way bigger audience. Also, there's a huge third-party community making really good sounding stuff for the platform too. And I just have to conclude that it just hasn't been their focus since 2009.
All right. So do you still, do you still use software, amp and pedal software? And if you were going to use it, would you use Apple at this point, or is there some other kind that you would prefer?
I still tend to use the Apple stuff just because I know it so well and I can work really fast. It depends on the project. A lot of time it's 100% analog. Depends what the client wants or what I'm doing, whether I'm doing something for myself. With the record I just made, which has a lot of contrasting sounding guitars, I would tend to work directly in Logic as shorthand, and then come back later and see if I could tweak the sound inside the computer. And more often than not, I wound up reamping them through a nice amplifier and re-recording it. But in terms of covering a lot of ground really fast and building a quick arrangement and making things come together very quickly, Logic's pretty amazing.
Well, that's a perfect segue, because we should get into the new record, which is amazing. I've sent some links to a friend of mine who is a classical music critic and has been, has extensive knowledge of a lot of the music that you recorded, but in played with, I guess, more traditional instruments. And he was blown away. He loved it. I mean, he's a very...
Oh, that's so nice to hear.
Yeah.
I sometimes imagine that all the early music people are going to come after me with pitchforks, but that's a hot topic of debate among musicologists these days. When I played this stuff as a teen, it was the midst of a great explosion in early music. There were so many recordings being made where people were rebuilding antique instruments and pursuing early music with a scholarly detail and authenticity that had been unprecedented until then, performing in just intonation rather than our well-tempered intonation system, rebuilding old instruments based on what they saw in drawings and paintings. And it was a very exciting time to be authentic. And the stuff that I heard at that time was really blowing my mind. And I've always continued to listen to that stuff, and I have a great interest in authentic historical performance. But this project is 180 degrees flip side of that, which was well, first of all, the record is entirely of music from the 1300s, from European music from the 1300s, from France, the Low Countries, England, and Italy. And I play the music note for note as it appeared in the manuscripts. I'm faithful to the compositions. And when I say manuscripts, it's this music predates the printing press by the better part of a century. So it really is what we know is what people wrote down with a quill on a piece of parchment. And I'm faithful to the compositions, but I gave no thought to historic instrumentation, electric guitars, keyboards, drum machines, whatever. And in a way, that's not as sacrilegious as it might sound, because this is kind of hard. The one thing about medieval music that's so fascinating is because they just perceived music and musicianship and music's role in the world and human beings' role in the universe in a way that's so different from how we think today, that a big part of the fun and the challenge is, trying to get inside that head. And believe it or not, at that time, there was almost no concept of composing for a specific instrument. There's a couple of exceptions, but by and large, a composer didn't think in terms of this is for a string quartet, or this is for a choir of male voices, or this is for a medieval fiddle and a lute and a medieval organ. They wrote notes. And the understanding was that when they were performed, you would use whatever was on hand. And some things we know, if it's a piece of liturgical music for church, it was probably sung by unaccompanied voices. But you might have a composition with 4 parts, and it might have been sung by 4 voices, or might have been played by 4 instruments, or might have been 3 instruments accompanying a voice. The idea of the composer's vision encompassing the instruments that would play the music really doesn't develop till around 1600, till about 200 years after the period I was looking at. So obviously they weren't thinking of electric guitars and drum machines, but a composer would have had every expectation that each performance might differ in terms of who's singing and playing.
Well, speaking of the notes, from the reproductions that you show in the downloadable PDF file, I'm curious how I see the notes are there on a staff, but I don't see the rhythmic notation that I'm used to. How did you determine How do you determine the rhythmic notation from that kind of notation?
When I studied this stuff when I was younger, I did some work in reading the notation. Today, I'm working entirely from scholarly editions that reproduce the music in modern notation.
Oh, okay.
So to go straight from the medieval notation to notes on the instrument, I would have to do a refresher course and do some serious study. But there were conventions, and in fact, there is information about the rhythms. And also there was still, for most of the Middle Ages, there was a concept of rhythmic modes. When we say mode, we think of a scale, but they would think of rhythms in that particular, in that sort of way too. So part of it would be knowing the rhythmic mode. There are ways of showing the notation. It's not standardized. One, probably the most famous image of medieval music, which I produced in the record, and it's easily found online, and it's so beautiful, there's a very famous piece called Belle, Bon, Sage, which means good, beautiful, wise, sort of a courtly love song. And it's notated in the form of a heart. If you Google Belle, Bon, Sage, you'll find the image, and it's handwritten on parchment. It's a very beautiful piece of calligraphy, and it uses colors to help define the rhythm. Most of the notes are in black, but if a note was rendered in red, it meant you were departing from the expected rhythm. So there were a set of conventions, but generally when I looked at manuscripts a lot while I was working this, but when it came time to record, I was relying more on the work of other musicologists who rendered it into contemporary notation.
And how did you decide what guitars to use, and what guitars did you use, and sounds, which sounds to use on any given piece?
That was the hardest part of the record. It took me a long time to make this, but 2/3 of the time was just figuring out how to do it. It was kind of a COVID project, and I started on it not long after COVID started, which is going on 2 years ago. And I tried so many experiments. I mean, a lot of this music I thought would work really well in a heavy context. And it probably would, but I wasn't the one to do it. Just everything I tried just sounded really phony. And I tried things that were more electronic. I thought about doing it all acoustically. And then after a lot of experimenting, I sort of settled on well, first of all, I settled on the rule book. I had experimented with, not necessarily rendering the music faithfully. And then once I had the concept of, I'm playing the compositions more or less as they were written, but taking free rein on the instrumentation and production. That sounds simple, but it took me a long time to just arrive at that. And then I settled on a basic palette, which is largely about just what I can play, which is, plucked strings. There's no drum kits, but there's a lot of hand percussion. There's some electronics, but most of the electronics have kind of a wheezy, ancient quality, a lot of things that evoke, vacuum tube synthesizers and things like that, mellotrons. So the basic palette is fretted instruments, acoustic and electric, non-drum kit percussion, and archaic, distressed sounding keyboard tones, if that makes sense. And it took me a long time to get there, but once I did, everything started moving really quickly. I spent more time trying to figure out what the hell to do than I did actually recording the album.
Now, some of those distress sounds sound very Crownhorn-like, or something along,
There's a lot of evoking, yeah. I once played Crownhorn. I used to have a Crownhorn in my dorm room in college.
Yeah. Not many can say that.
That's the way that, talk about a way to get dates.
So what guitars did you use for it?
I just kind of grabbed stuff off the wall. I'm lucky to have a really pretty recording studio downstairs that my wife designed. And I would just sit down and pluck something off the wall and try it. And a lot of times that involves, I'm mainly because I'm old and I've had some instruments for a very long time. I have a couple of really nice vintage instruments that I've, had since I was young. But in recent years, I've gotten into building these weird DIY guitars. And I'm not a luthier. When I say DIY guitar, I mean like buying bodies, buying parts, buying necks and screwing them together. I'm not a woodworker. But I've done a lot of experimentation with guitar electronics. And I do a lot of experimentation with weird mix and match stuff, like Fender-y flavored pickups in, say, Gibson flavored wood, or building onboard effects into the guitars. So I used a lot of my weird DIY guitars just because they're kind of fun, and that some of them do interesting electronic things. And the electronic stuff that I tend to like a lot, that isn't the norm for guitars, not unprecedented, but not the norm. I work a lot with dual filters, like using tone controls, low cut tone controls, as well as the standard high cut tone control. I do a lot of onboard overdrives. I do a lot of input capacitor switching. Again, that's the low filtering, and just dicking around with that stuff is just something that's interested me a lot as a guitar player over the last decade or so. So I probably the majority of the instruments were my weird DIY guitars.
That's interesting, because the electric guitars, I mean, I assume you use some acoustic guitars as well.
Oh yeah, there's acoustic. I mean, the acoustic guitars are just acoustic. You know.
Yeah, and but there's a warm, almost woody sound to most of the electric guitar sounds I noticed, which fits the music. I thought fits the music beautifully. I mean, on Gloria, is that a baritone?
It's 4 bass sixes plus bass.
Ah, that's right. Yeah, and that you're playing a bass six in that. What was the that best band you ever played with?
Oh right, with the Another Night on Earth project,
Right. Yeah.
which was another wonderful COVID silver lining, was working in an international group of electric guitarists who specialize in classical music. And I've never been in heavier musical company in my life. It's 8 players, and the skill level is off the charts. I'm the slow kid in that class.
All right. Well, I want to talk about that too. I sent that to my friend, and he loved that as well.
Oh, that's makes me really happy. Thank you.
Yeah, he's very open. I mean, he liked Michael Bolton's opera record. I mean, it's like, and he is a renowned opera critic. You know, he's very open about people attempting things out of their comfort zone. But yeah, before we get to that, on My Sweet Nightingale, is there a melodica on that, or is
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just melodica. And I do use a lot of samples. One of the sound wells that I go to a lot is zithers, plucked instruments that are usually played with hammers, and a lot of that samples of instruments. There's some of the stuff that you think is electronic on the record isn't, and some of the stuff that, well, vice versa.
Are you triggering the samples?
Just playing them on the keyboard.
Oh, on the keyboard. Okay.
I don't really use guitar. I've done some work with MIDI guitar, but keyboard's just a better instrument trigger than a guitar is. Yeah. For a lot of not just the latency, not just the fact that with guitar it has to go through a pitch to conversion stage to generate a MIDI signal, whereas on a keyboard the MIDI signal is instantaneous, so it's easier to perform because there's not any lag time. But also, keyboard's a much more logical way to make music than guitar. It's just you know greater polyphony, greater independence of the hands. You can play more notes simultaneously. You can play more interacting parts.
Then you're not dealing with the overtones of, you can do close harmony stuff, but you're not dealing with the overtones confusing the guitar synthesizer, which can be another issue. Now, Harp of Melody is kind of
that's my favorite piece on the record. Actually, after we finish talking today, I'm going to go back to work on a video I'm making for that song. But that's a very special composition. Now,
is that a round, or they call that a canon?
It's a canon. It's written for 3 parts. And when I say 3 parts, this is, if you look at the score of a Beethoven symphony, it fills up the whole page, all the instruments, woodwinds on the top, brass, strings, percussion, and it could be 20, 30 lines. You look at a modern 20th century score and it could be 40 lines or more. That wasn't true of medieval music. They were writing music for between 1 and 4 parts generally. And everything on my record was written for between 2 and 4 parts. What I mean by the parts is it's an individual melody. But in my rendering, that melody might be, well, one cheat I used is I did permit myself octave transposition. So I might take a part and double it at the octave, which is something that's not authentic to the Middle Ages. Or a part that might have been sung by a male baritone voice might go to bass guitar and drop down an octave below where it would have been originally sung. So you get that wall shaking bass that is not a part of medieval music, except for maybe for an organ. So the number of parts is small, but I went with the concept of adding a lot of sonic variation within the parts. So there might be 3 parts, but it might bounce between different choirs of instruments. With Harp of Melody, it starts out with What You Hear Is What You Get. It's just 3 guitars. And then other instruments join in. and you get the zithers, the things that sound like hammered dulcimers, or every culture in the world has some sort of zither, whether it's like a Middle Eastern qanun, or Northern European, what do they call it in Finland, kantella, or Hungarian, zither. But it's something that you find in a lot of different places on Earth, where it's a box with suspended strings and you hit it with picks or mallets or something. So there's that flavor coming in, added a lot of percussion. They did use percussion in the Middle Ages, but it wasn't, not always, and it wasn't notated in the music. So I went for a lot of color variation within each line. But if you strip it down to its essentials, it's really just a few interacting parts.
Well, I'm always curious how you do it. Like, in other words, when it's just you. So would you lay down one part and then
Yeah,
go
I
back?
did. Yes, I did have a system, and I input everything I was contemplating playing into a music notation program. Even if I had the written score, I would put it into notation for two reasons. One is the act of entering it into notation helps you learn it. It helps you internalize it. This might be just me, but it's the same thing with writing. When I was focusing more on writing fiction, in my past, and reading works by far greater writers, and a lot of people keep a notebook of memorable turns of phrases, or just something, or highlighting it in the book, something that they think was marvelous that they might want to steal someday. I would often manually write stuff out, just because with my brain, there's something about the hand-brain connection that it sounds spacey and airy-fairy, but it kind of brings it into your body. But it's a way of studying the score. So like literally inputting every single note, kind of painstakingly sometimes, because I'm not the greatest music software entry virtuoso. But then I've gotten to know the piece pretty well. And when it's done, I can export my electronic score as a MIDI file. So I would go to the studio with just a generic MIDI file with the instruments. Then I took a lot of different approaches to tempo. One big difference between our pop music and classical music in general is in pop, we tend to either play to a click, or if we're not playing to a click, we aspire to have a click-like, consistency as we play. Exceptions, but by and large. And of course, with classical music, you have the notion of the conductor, and it breathes and stretches, and it tends not to be as metronomic, and there can be some variation from phrase to phrase. And with the 18 pieces on this record, it was everything from just straight metronomic click with no variation to writing a very, very, very elaborate conducting track, like a tempo map, as a substitute for an orchestral conductor, and have it stretch and breathe and compact. And it was sort of my sense of what would suit the tune. And then I would start replacing the MIDI parts with guitars were usually the port of first call, but sometimes keyboards. And there's even one example on the record where it's just my original MIDI track, just because it sounded kind of cool. It's that short organ piece called Estampie.
Yeah,
And
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, I could play it. It sounded cooler on the sequencer, so I just kept it and did a lot of signal processing on it to make the sound a lot hipper. But that's played by robot.
Well, that makes sense that when you're playing alone and you can do. That explains it very well. You put all the parts in and then just replace them. So there's always the other parts going, and where each part fits with the others. I was also curious, the duo that you did with Heiko Assig,
who was the founder of the aforementioned Another Night on Earth,
okay,
electric guitar octet. Heiko's a great player and scholar from Hamburg, Germany.
And so I was curious, how did you guys do that? Because you're going back and forth. So are you, when you're playing, does one person start and then leave space for the other person?
In
It's
that case, in that case, well, that was one of the pieces where there's a lot of tempo variation. If you speak music software at all, this will make sense. Usually in most sequencers, and of course I was working in Logic, you could have a field where you have the tempo. And a lot of times in pop music, you just don't touch it. It's 140 BPM start to finish. Da, da, da. But you can use like breakpoint animation to change the speed. And it did look like something on a seismograph, or a lie detector test. That's all over the place. And that was, and then I used that as my map. And then I played both guitar parts, and then Heiko replaced one of the parts and played it a lot better than I did. But that was a workflow that came out of the Another Night on Earth project, which is the person in that band who is maybe the least technically accomplished guitar player is almost certainly the heaviest musician I've ever worked with, because guitar playing is a hobby for him, but he's an internationally renowned conductor. He's in charge of the conducting program at Juilliard. Anyone who studies conducting at Juilliard studies under David Robertson. He just likes playing. He has a nice Telecaster and a Les Paul, and he likes playing. And he was the conductor for a lot of this work. And most folks who are musicians probably know this already, but we don't really have the technology yet to play in real time. Huh. The fastest possible connection, even with relatively low latency, like in a Zoom talk, in a well-functioning Zoom talk, Michael and I can chat, and it feels like a real conversation, and there isn't a perceptible delay. But the delays that are there are enough to completely fuck up any musical performance. You basically can't do it. So most people work with a click, and then you all synchronize to the click. So with some of the pieces that wanted a more conductorly approach, we kind of had to invent a way to do it. And David's process was he studied the score as if he were going to conduct it in front of an ensemble. But instead of just getting up and conducting, he would figure out what he wanted to hear. And he made a click track that was highly variable, tempo changes all over the place. And we would build it around that. So it's completely back-assward from how classical music is normally played. Yet it enabled us to make a classical music non-metronomic click track type performance when we're scattered all over the world. And for the duet, which is called Cacciando un Giorno, I made that click track, but I was completely stealing my methodology from what I'd learned from David.
So what's it like trying to follow a click track that is not steady? I mean,
it's like, well, did you ever play in, did you ever play in high school band or orchestra?
Yeah, of course.
You follow the conduct, in classical music, it's not, there's moments when it's really steady, but it breathes. You get to the end of the phrase and you let it have a little bit of air. It gets exciting and you start to push it ahead a little bit. And it's just a very, very different way of thinking about rhythm. But it's not a new concept, but generally it relies on having either one person standing there with the baton, or if you're playing in a string quartet, it might be the first violinist who's kind of giving bodily cues about the tempo. But the tempo does move around.
Well, I know.
And we've all played pop music who does that. And those, and of course, we're all kind of caught in that dilemma of, we have an expectation that pop music, and by pop music, I mean basically anything that's not classical. Right. It can be hip hop, it can be pop, it can be rock and roll, but we have an expectation that it's going to be kind of metronomic. But at the same time, a lot of us have our favorite old records where they speed up and slow down, and we love it for that. If you like listening to Stax R&B from the 60s, that ain't metronomic.
Oh no, or those are the Rolling Stones. I mean, you listen to the beginning of Brown Sugar. It's I mean, Keith starts dun 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 dun, and then the band comes in dun dun dun. I mean, they got to be 3 clicks slower than he started it. Which I mean, that's all fine. I mean, and you're absolutely right, and I understand that. And
We like that stuff, but we're afraid to do it because we think people will think we don't know what we're doing.
well, but I'm more what I'm trying to drill down on though is the technical challenge of playing to a click track that's moving. That because when you play with a click track, you have an expectation. People have an expectation that it's going to, but the beat, each click is going to be in the same place, and you're trying to stay steady with that. But trying to anticipate how much it's slowing down. I mean, to me, it
Well,
just
that's,
feels like
I mean, you can
different.
ask that question to anyone who plays in a band or orchestra with a conductor. It's just a different way of taking your tempo. In this case, remember, I was starting with MIDI files. So when I put it on the computer, I would have the notes played robotically with no expression, but the parts were in place,
Right.
and it was metronomic. And as I start writing, I could think, let's let this phrase breathe a little at the end. So so I'd write it in manually and dick with it until it felt right. So I have the music as a guide. By the time I've created that tempo map, I'm hearing the target tempo. It sounds robotic and unexpressive, but I can listen to it, get used to it, know how the phrases are going to go. But that question does lead to something that was one of the biggest challenges and biggest surprises of this record, which is one of the things that are really alien about medieval music to our ears. The way they heard things that are just like Mars from our perspective is this music predates the notion of chords. Now, how are we defining chords? You have multiple parts and they're playing different notes. And if 3 instruments are playing 3 different notes at the same time, technically you'd call it a chord. But the way we think of music, like a Beatles song, where you say, okay, it's 4 bars of C, and then it goes to A minor, then it goes to F, and surprise, it's an F minor. And you kind of get these blocked out roadmaps of the chords. That's the basic premise of pre-modern jazz, is you have these chord fields, and then you improvise melodies that suit this bedrock of chord structure. That, by the end of the 14th century, you're just starting to get the first barest hints of that sensibility. But there's no chords to this music. There's lines that move independently, and they produce harmonies. And there were very elaborate rules and conventions for how the voices interacted. They weren't completely free. You had to, they had rules about what was an accepted harmony and what was not. But it's all about how these 3 individual voices moving through space, and they're not subject maybe think of it as like a ship going through the Panama Canal where it's locks, and like the first lock is the first 4 bars of C major. And there's a lot of freedom about what you might do over C major, but the C major is this overarching box. And then you go into the next lock, which represents a different chord. And again, you can move however you want that coordinates with this box, but you have this kind of box structure. Think of a lead sheet that has chords written on the top. There's your boxes, and you play to suit. Oops, gesticulating so much I knocked over my computer. That didn't exist yet.
But how does that differ from post 14th century classical music? I mean, obviously it differs.
Well, when you listen to, because classical musicians generally don't think in terms of chord changes, and they have a different language for talking about chords. And Bach never thought this way, but you can take any Bach piece and write out a chord chart for it. There's nobody strumming B minor, underneath the violin arpeggios, but you get a sense you could write the chord chart, or Beethoven or Mozart or anything from after the late late 17th century. You can do that with up through modernism, where it goes out the window. But like your mainstream classical music, you can write, you can say what the chord changes are. You can say what the chord changes are to the Nutcracker Suite, or to Mozart's C minor piano concerto, or Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor. You could strum a guitar along with it if you knew the right chords, and it would sound stupid, but it would harmonize.
Yeah, I once wrote out a chart for Bizet's Pearl Fisher, one of Bizet's Pearl Fisher.
Sure, absolutely. In fact, I have right here on my shelf one of my favorite music books. It's called the Classical Music Fake Book, and it's hundreds and hundreds of classical themes written in the style of the real book, of like a jazz cheat sheet, where it's just got the melody and the chords. And it's not how classical composers thought, and it's not how classical musicians generally conceptualize the music, but it's there for real.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that it got thrown out the window with modern classical music, because for me, when my aforementioned friend used to play me early music like this, like Gesualdo and stuff like that, it always sounded amazingly modern to me.
Well, Gesualdo is pretty much 200 years after the material I'm playing on this record, and that's one of the big changes that happened over the Renaissance, is it did move towards a much more chordal concept.
Well, no, I mean, he sounds post-chordal. He sounds to me, or at least the harmonies that he's using sound
very chromatic. It's very chromatic,
more modern. Yeah. So, but this music also sounds more in a weird way. Sounds 14th century music sounds more modern somehow to my ears than, and maybe just because it's fresher and I haven't heard it before, than later 15th and 16th and 17th century, than Mozart and Bach and that kind of stuff.
Those conventions weren't in place yet, and what results sometimes sounds really alien and dissonant to our ears, and we think dissonant means modern.
Yeah, I guess that's it.
And Gesualdo is chords, but it's bizarre chord progressions, like a Gesualdo. Again, I'm using an anachronistic language of chord progressions to describe a music that wasn't conceived that way. But you could take a Gesualdo piece and it might be A major going to C minor, going to F sharp minor, and it's chordal, but it's not like what we think of as a common practice chord progression. Another weird thing about this, and right now I'm starting to think about a record of music from the following century. And the thing that's exciting about that, I'm just doing my first research and starting to look for scores and things. You see it happening. Like people start writing bass lines that go 1-5-1, which you don't have in medieval music. The other thing that makes this music sound so alien is thirds and sixths were not recognized as consonant intervals. They occur, but you would never rest there. So when you get to the end of a phrase, it's you might have a C in the low voice and a C in the high voice and a G in the middle voice, but you'd never in a million years have an E or an E flat as part of that resolution. It just didn't sound like an ending. So that gives this music a very hollow sort of sound, because it relies a lot on intervals of fourths and fifths, and it's kind of what makes it sound eerie and otherworldly. Sometimes it's, some people hear it as the spiritual quality of medieval music, that it just sounds kind of not of the earthly plane. And it's partly because it just doesn't hum like major and minor chords do. And you literally see that coming together like at the end of the century. And the penultimate track on the record is by a British composer named Dunstable, who was crucial in introducing that kind of what we think of as a more modern chordal harmony. And over the next century, it develops, and then by the end of the following century, you're hearing a lot of triads. I knew that going in. What was really surprising and difficult and humbling was that those open, hollow sounding harmonies had rhythmic repercussions, which sounds really counterintuitive, but I'll try to explain. A lot of, a good musician can play to a metronome. A really good musician can negotiate with the metronome. Like, in modern language, we'd call it pocket, like a drummer who's knows damn well where the beat is, but the snare's coming down, 12 milliseconds behind the beat every time. And, and we, when we play, we pull back, we push forward, and that pulse is always there. We're interacting with it, but we're not necessarily straight on it. Something about these hollow sounding intervals of fourths and fifths made things that weren't rhythmically perfect sound weird. Like when I like, especially the stuff I played, like, rock music or Tom Waits records, I'm used to kind of a loosey-goosey feel. And, you kind of follow your intuition. And if it comes a little early or a little bit late, that's a benefit, not a problem. It's feel. This music really wanted to be lined up. And so many times I would record parts, and it wasn't played like a robot, but I would have said, hey, my time's pretty tight. But then the flamming and slightly off stuff sounded terrible in a way that it wouldn't with fatter chords. Maybe it's just me, but that's how I heard it. So I was absolutely pushed to my utmost in terms of playing with rhythmic accuracy and doubling parts. And I confess I did a lot of rhythmic fixing after the fact. I did a lot of lining up parts that were almost but not quite in time, because I would never do that on a pop record. If I was playing with someone else, that's what we all hate. But this music sort of required it. I mean, I didn't like put it on, like exactly on a Beat Detective style grid, but if three things hit, they wanted to hit at the same time. So I was, pushed to the utmost of my ability to play in time. And then on top of that, I needed to do a little bit of computer assistance.
Do you think some of that is due to the sparseness of it?
Yes.
I
think it's the hollow. I think it's a rhythmic side effect of a harmonic property. And maybe I'm talking shit because that really isn't very logical, but that's just
no. I think it makes sense. I mean, just like an orchestra, it's not that crucial that everybody hits the beat exactly right. Part of the sound of it is them, not hitting it exactly the same. That fattens it out. But I mean, yeah, these things vary from types of music. Like I once went to a show, Mark Cohn, the singer Mark Cohn.
I know, I don't know.
You know of him? Yeah. I mean, he had a function band in New York called the Supreme Court.
Uh-huh.
They did covers, and they had horns, and they would do R&B stuff. And I went with my first wife, who, like my current wife, had a really great sense of music. And we walk in and she hears them playing, and the first thing she says is, the horns are too in tune. And it's because the nature of that kind of music, the horns are not, they used to play purposely out of tune because it would just be like two players at stacks, and they would play slightly out of tune. That made the sound fatter, whereas if you're playing perfectly in tune, you sound like the Maynard Ferguson big band, and it doesn't sound like.
That is a really, really compelling point. Also, I should also say too, one of my cheats is this music in its day would have been performed in just intonation. And talking about intonation can be the most boring rabbit hole imaginable. So I'm going to try to keep this really simple and short. But our tuning system, equal temperament, allows us to play in all 24 keys with equal out of tuneness. And every key is slightly out of tune, but no key is worse than the other. We don't hear it as out of tune. We just hear it as music because that's what we make. But if you go back to the origins of musical intervals, which are based on mathematical ratios, like an octave is a 2-to-1 ratio, 3-to-2 ratios, they're tuned different. Here's a guitar example. Have you ever had the experience of, say, you're tuning your guitar from top to bottom by ear? And I'll even say, God knows if this is in tune. That could be worse. Because if you're tuning up and you go, there's my fourth, there's my fourth, there's my, and then you get to the third, let's say it's really flat. When does it sound good? That sounds kind of like a sweet third, but in fact, my second string is still a little bit flat. It's going to be more like that. And that's how people made music until around 1700. And the disadvantage of that system is that some keys are more in tune than others. And earlier music tends not to modulate through a bunch of keys. So it was a system that worked. I'm not using that at all. I'm playing this music with modern intonation. So it would have rang differently when performed. And if you listen to good recordings of good early music ensembles, be they vocal or instrumental, they're playing in just intonation. It has a certain ring to it. And the fact that I was playing in modern intonation, I think contributed to the finickiness of the way some of the notes interacted. Getting back to your other point, that is an endlessly fascinating topic. Those of us who play or produce or consume pop music, we're familiar with this dynamic of modern records are tend to be very, very metronomic, tend to be strictly metronomic, and there's an expectation that we hear that, and that was less true in the past. And this sounds dopey, but this happens again and again and again. We might love that old record where the timing isn't perfect, but when it comes our time to do it and we're in the studio, when we're being self-critical, or we're trying to make a record that's going to sell or be a hit, we kind of tend to chicken out and line everything up in time. And also, at the other hand, you can also listen to some old records. Oh, I'm saying records from, like say R&B records from the 60s and 70s that you can't believe how fucking in time it is. James Brown and his band, they could just as well be playing to a click. It's right on it. The Spinners records, Philly Soul always tends to be really straight metronomic. A lot of disco is metronomic, because famously the Bee Gees were using tape loops. Like Staying Alive they didn't have a sequencer, but they had a loop of the drum beat, so it does not change.
Well, you also had guys like the late Yogi Horton, a drummer who he would pride himself being able to tap his foot or his hand as his car entered a tunnel with with a record, like a disco record or metronomic disco record, and be exactly in time with it when he came out of the tunnel. And these guys, that was in the 70s, they were working. It was inevitable that you would have drum machines because the drummers were working at becoming metronomic. So you might as well just have a machine do it.
No, and it's and great, and again, and great drummers. It's just like I just did a session with the great band and session drummer Matt Chamberlain, who's played on a million records, and he was in both Soundgarden and Pearl Jam. Lovely guy too, and he's he could do that tunnel trick. And he could also say, I'm going to deviate 3% from that tunnel trick. Well-trained, great players do that. But I'm speaking in broad generalizations. A lot of us like that old stuff. Just the other day, I was listening to a record that I loved a lot when I was a young teen, and probably haven't listened to much since then. But Todd Rundgren's Something Anything album. And that was the first record where he tried playing all the instruments himself. And he's not the greatest drummer, but he does his thing, and it sounds like cool pop music. And one of the most famous songs from that record is called Couldn't I Just Tell You? And it's not in the same tempo for more than 2 bars. It is like a boat on a stormy sea, but it's cool. But it's, like it wouldn't pass muster in most sessions today. But also there's an equivalent in the classical music world. And this is a really interesting topic of debate, which is the technical, like as in so many other things, the technical ability of musicians has increased and increased and increased. And with orchestras, and today's anyone who's playing in a major orchestra has achieved an astonishing level of musicianship to get that gig. But 130 years ago or so, in the late Romantic period, composers started writing increasingly complex orchestral music. And then around the turn of the century, you get composers like, Richard Strauss, who were writing stuff that was just so complicated or fast or complex. And no way are you going to have, 30 violins playing it exactly the same. But when people play it today, it's remarkably accurate. And it begs the question, was the composer's intention, was the composer's ultimate dream that someday the orchestra truly could play what he wrote exactly, everybody as one unit, or was he going for a smear effect?
Yeah, well, that's what I was saying before about, about the orchestras when not coming down on the thing. And, it's all, obviously, it's all a matter of taste. It's all a matter of, your part in the expression, what serves the music, what makes the music work. Like, for example, playing soul music with horns that are perfectly in tune just doesn't sound right. And, and playing, by the same token, I mean, I listened to Americana station in Nashville, and I mean, the amount of singers that are singing patently off key are appalling. And it's not, and there's I mean, this is a whole other discussion, but that the whole authenticity thing of, well, if we fix it, or, if we compress it, or if we actually make it sound good, then it's not authentic. And there's a lot of that going around.
Well, there's some of that, but then a lot of, like, listen to Merle Travis. It's perfect.
Oh no, that the old guys,
it's like it's perfectly in time. He sings every note.
The old guys were perfect.
They could do that.
That's
the
my whole
skill.
point. I mean, the old guys could sing their asses off and play their asses off, and the rhythm sections grooved and swung and did everything. But there's, I mean, I don't want to get off on this topic, but there is a thing in the Americana world that if it sound it, and I think we have to have this discussion some other time, but I think it comes out of the punk aesthetic that if it sounds too good, it's somehow inauthentic. If it's played
which I have some. I know what you mean, and our mutual friend Sean Hammond, who edits Premier Guitar, just wrote a very funny editorial, kind of making fun of that very sensibility and some of the cliches of the genre. And if you haven't seen it,
I look forward to seeing it. But
but on the other hand, it was, as a classical musician who cut ties with rock and then got interested again with punk and especially post-punk, I can see both sides of the argument, but I've often had the attitude of, you go to these genres for different things. And, the expectations and what makes a gratifying classical music experience can be very different from what makes a gratifying, punk or rock and roll experience. And for that reason, people often tend to assume that I have a big progressive rock background. And I probably should have had one, but I kind of got into classical instead. And listening back years later with my punk attitude sanded down and being more open-minded, I can perceive the brilliance of bands like Genesis and Yes, and I know that was really important music and often really great music. But there's still a part of me that's like, you're trying to bring the values of classical music into the rock realm. And if I want your intelligence, if I want your complication, if I want your interesting meter changes, I'll go to frickin' Stravinsky. You're not as good. You're not as interesting. And if I'm wanting a rock experience, I want like an elemental passion or a violence or a volatility. I'm speaking in really broad generalizations, and I have a more nuanced view of this as an older person. But part of me still thinks that. Here's just one more classical music example because it's so interesting and so famous. Stravinsky's most famous piece is The Rite of Spring. And very famously, it was so revolutionary that the audience rioted in Paris when it was performed. He was out to shock. And it's a ballet that's set in a primitive world, like a Neolithic sort of world, or where it's a primitive ritual where they literally danced to death. And he was, you know, it was like brutal and hard and no, nothing syrupy, nothing romantic. It was just hard modern edges. And very famously, the first note in the piece is, a lot of people think it's an oboe. Let me see if I'm into it. Where did I end up after my out of tune major experience? So, and that C is played by a bassoon. And no one wrote notes that high for a bassoon. It was a freakishly high note. And it seems to me that he was going for a deliberately brutal effect. It would, you know, that it would be, the piece starts on this impossible to play note, and they're trying so hard and there's so much tension. But in the 100 years plus since that piece was written, every bassoon player plays that note. It's just part, you know, it's the most famous, one of the most famous bassoon parts ever written. And if you're a bassoon player, you damn well play that note and way well higher. So if you hear it today, it's played beautifully and lyrically. Was that what Stravinsky wanted? Or did he want it to be like this? You know, that's a really fascinating debate for me.
Well, I mean, it is the debate of interpretation. You know, it's obviously more. It's obviously central to classical music because central music is all interpretation. I mean, people are not making the notes up on the spot. They're not writing their own material. They're, you know, so it's all about how you interpret it, but it crosses over to other musics also, as we know. You know, I mean, I mean, you could even say, I mean, one of my issues with a lot of not modern, but current jazz players is I'll hear them playing basically, you know, bebop, and they're playing or maybe slightly post bebop stuff, and they're playing the stuff that, you know. And I had this experience walking into Amoeba in the Haight, where I hear this bebop piano playing being played, and you know, and I'm not even that big a bebop fan, and I had become less so as time progressed.
You and I share that.
Well, partly because from years of hearing people imitating bebop, you know, younger players playing bebop, I walked in and heard this bebop piano, and I'm going, wow, that's amazing. And I looked, and it was one of the guys, I forgot who it was at the time, but it was one of the guys who invented it. You know, and that's the difference between hearing. So when you're talking about, you know, interpretation, I mean, in classical music, it's all about interpretation. And you really, you know, ultimately you do want to, I would feel, unless you're going to do what you did, which is, you know, completely throw the concept of authenticity out the window and do something different with it, that's fine. But and what you were saying earlier about the blues, as you get closer to trying to emulate the originals, you get farther away from any kind of emotional connection. Because
that's you know, I think you and I could really bond on this issue, because for me, listening to music is 50% about history, and one of the great joys of music for me is thinking how it was perceived in its day, and what how we hear it today differently. A good example is Mozart. You know, it's very beautiful, perhaps the greatest composer who ever lived by some definitions. But we hear Mozart today and it's just sweet and beep beep, you know, oh, that's nice. Oh, that's so beautiful, I love that. Or, oh, classical music, whatever, it's boring. And some of Mozart is blood and thunder violent, like the C minor piano concerto, the C minor piano sonata, parts of Don Giovanni. It was like tearing the house down, but we can't, you know, it doesn't sound that way to us anymore.
Well, that's
early rock and roll that we think is, you know, it sounded heavy in its day, and to, you know, it isn't. That's not heavy at all. But
Well, but you can still hear the difference. I mean, that's that Richard Goddard, the producer Richard Goddard. I think he did
Sure,
Robert
yeah.
Gordon. I mean, they asked him once, what's the difference between the modern rockabilly guys like, the Stray Cats and Robert Gordon and the original guys. And he goes, well, when you listen to the original guys, it sounds like they finished the session, went home and killed their parents. But it's still there. It's not. I don't think yes, we can't possibly know what it felt like to hear that originally. But if the music is creating, I mean, you're hearing that blood and guts in Mozart. You're hearing that stuff. If it's in the music, we can still hear it, and that's, I think, what gives us less patience for people that are pale imitations.
It's agreed. Also with this, if swinging it back to the medieval project for a second, even though I'm happy to move on, but when a lot of people, I mean, it does sound pretty. It's not. I mean, some of the music is really weird and complicated, but it's generally, a nice sounding record that doesn't drive people out of the room. But when people think about, when you say like medieval music, the image that a lot of people have is kind of, maybe sort of a Renaissance fair picture, and knights and ladies doing a courtly dance, and or maidens around the maypole with ribbons in their hair, and it's this bucolic sort of thing. That's not the music I'm playing on this record. The music that I'm playing was written by the most extreme avant-garde intellectuals for an audience of fellow avant-garde intellectuals. This was not folk music. This was not anything people did at the country dance. This was like, the utmost of the privileged intellectuals, sometimes writing this complex music to impress each other, I think. But this is not, young lad woos pretty maiden music. It's brainiac music, mad scientist lab stuff.
Cool. I think that's a good place to end the interview. I mean, so let's say goodbye. And
it's always interesting to talk to you, Michael, especially when we disagree, because you're really smart and you make your case really well. That was really a pleasure. I could easily talk to you for another 10 hours, but let's give poor listeners a break.
Okay, well, we'll say goodbye. I'll turn off the recording. We can talk a little after.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the nice things you said about the record. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me. I had a blast, as always.
And I recommend everybody go out and get it. It's definitely modern on many levels. This being Guitar Moderne.
Oh, I should mention the name. It's called Falling Through Time: Music from the 1300s. Or you can just remember my name. It's my first record under my own name. So if you're on Spotify or Apple Music or whatever, and if you say play something by Joe Gore, this record will come up. So I'm easy to find.
Great. All right.